Good afternoon and welcome to our briefing, The Colorado River. I'm Dan Brissett, President of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. This panel is the fourth installment in our ongoing briefing series about resilient and healthy rivers. EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have worked to provide science-based information about environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We try really hard to ensure that all of our resources are timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. Put a lot of thought into our resources to always be science-based and ready when congressional staff need the information. And this early in the year, there's a lot of change and transition as new members are getting situated and new staff are eager to dig in and get to work. In addition to river health and resilience, we cover a lot of other topics at EESI, and I hope everyone takes a moment to RSVP for our Congressional Climate Camp briefing series, which continues next week. The first Congressional Climate Camp on January 29th was an interactive refresher on the drivers of climate change and the latest deployable solutions to address the challenge. Last week, we organized a briefing about the budget, appropriations, and reconciliation. Yes, that was a pretty timely briefing. Everything we do is always available online at www.eesi.org. And to keep up with everything we do, the best way to stay in the loop is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. The goal of this briefing series is to highlight solutions and examine issues impacting U.S. rivers and the communities situated along them. In 2024, we covered the Mississippi and the Tennessee rivers. Most recently, we took a dip in the Columbia River. These briefings are available to watch online at www.eesi.org. You should sign up for the whole series, which is set to run through the rest of this year, to make sure you receive presentation materials as well as summary notes for each briefing. Today, it's all about the Colorado River. The Colorado River is an essential source of water for agricultural, residential, and commercial purposes across Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, California, as well as Mexico. The same mighty river with the power and relentlessness to carve the Grand Canyon over eons today faces severe water stress, exacerbated by human-induced climate change. The future of the Colorado River is uncertain, and the communities and natural systems that depend on it for their lives and livelihoods are in jeopardy. We always appreciate everyone's feedback when you're participating in our congressional education. We'll put a QR code up here in just a moment if you have a moment now or at the end of the briefing to complete our survey and tell us what you think. We'd really appreciate that. We read every response, and we're going to be covering lots of great ground. In this briefing, we've got lots of other great briefings coming up, but maybe you have an idea for other topics, or maybe you have any feedback about the AV quality or the website or anything like that. It's all fair game. We really appreciate everyone's feedback. We have three tremendous speakers, and they're going to say a lot of great stuff and provide a lot of great information. And many in our online audience will have questions. If you're in our online audience and you have questions, you can submit questions by emailing us at ask, that's ask, at eesi.org, or you can follow us on social media at EESI Online. We're doing real-time coverage today on our Instagram story and Blue Sky. That brings us to the first of our three great panelists. Caitlin Ochs is a New York-based visual storyteller focused on documenting the impacts of climate change through the lens of water. Her current work as a National Geographic explorer investigates Southwestern farmers on the front lines of climate change. A member of the Society of Environmental Journalists and 2022 Metcalf Science Communication Fellow, Caitlin is dedicated to capturing powerful visuals connecting climate change to everyday life. Caitlin, I saw your slides. I got a preview of them the other day. They are tremendous. I'm so looking forward to your presentation. Let me turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Dan, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today for this briefing. I am, as Dan said, a visual journalist and National Geographic explorer, and I've spent about half a decade really documenting the Colorado River system, its communities, and challenges related to water access. And during this time, I have increasingly witnessed how the impacts of climate change are altering the lives of people that rely on this river. And I guess we'll go to next slide. I want to start with some geographical context. The Colorado is a snow-fed system that begins high in the Rocky Mountains. It flows through some of the most iconic landscapes in the Western US, such as this incredible section of the Grand Canyon you can see here. It spans an area roughly the size of Texas and exists in an extremely arid environment that receives under 20 inches of rain each year across the basin. And it's a river that's experiencing the hottest, driest period recorded in 1,500 years, which scientists have labeled as a mega drought. And this is really changing the river. Natural flows this century are 20% lower than average flows in the past century. And stated another way, it has lost an estimated 10 trillion gallons of water due to hotter, drier conditions driven by climate change. And it's a very critical freshwater lifeline that about 1 of every 10 humans living in the US, so 40 million people, rely on. And as Dan mentioned, it's shared by 30 federally recognized sovereign tribes and 7 Western states, so Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California. The basin tribes collectively hold rights to 1/4 of this river, and these communities are the original inhabitants of the basin. Yet many are still working to access water that is legally theirs or in the process of navigating complex settlement processes to secure their water rights. And this lack of water access really has had a significant negative impacts on their health, resilience, and communities. And it's widely acknowledged by state and federal officials that including tribal leadership in the river's governance process and determining their existing water rights settlements is really critical to managing this river into the future. The Colorado supports life in major Western cities such as Denver, Phoenix, LA, and San Diego. So here you can see people cooling off during a heat wave. Last summer, Phoenix experienced 35 consecutive days over 100 degrees. So water becomes really important on these days. And every year, half the river is diverted to irrigate 5 million acres of farmland, which contribute to 15% of US agricultural production. So how much use this freshwater system can support is being debated by stakeholders. And its largest major reservoirs are at critically low levels. So federal, state, and tribal officials are in the process of actively negotiating how to distribute long-term cuts after some sort of temporary drought agreements expire in 2026 to stabilize water levels into the future. And I think it's really important that when we're discussing cuts or policy change, that we remember, decisions about water governance are very much tied to people's lives. And in the arid Western US, water makes life possible, and communities are already feeling impacts of water scarcity. So I wanted to share a few images taken between 2022 and 2024. I spent time documenting farms in 3 areas of the Colorado River Basin, supported by a grant from the National Geographic Freshwater Initiative. So at the foot of the Sleeping Ute Mountain, I started in the northern part of the river's watershed, where the Ute Mountain Ute tribe has inhabited land for 10,000 years. And at the foot of the Sleeping Ute Mountain, a 7,600 acre farm operated by the Ute Mountain Ute Farm and Ranch produces corn, alfalfa, wheat, and a herd of several hundred cattle. For decades, it has operated successfully, providing economic opportunities for the nearby community of Toyac. And, it's a really tightly knit operation, this farm, and many people working there helped establish it from the ground up and remember clearing and transitioning piles of rock and brush into farmland. And under current Western water law, the oldest water users have the most secure water rights. So this becomes really important during times of shortage when lower priority water users face cuts before more senior water rights holders. And consecutive years of unprecedented hot, dry conditions in this basin have really deeply impacted the Ute farm. In 2021, with local reservoirs at critically low levels, the Ute Mountain Ute farm was one of several in the area that received notice of cuts to their water supply due to these shortages. And so that year, they received just 10% of their normal water deliveries. So to survive, they had to fallow 6,000 of their, acres of their farm, and they were forced to lay off half their staff. In 2022, they received 40% of their normal water supply, and center pivot after center pivot stood silent. Operating with a really small crew, everyone was anxious about what the coming year would bring, but 2023 brought reprieve. And for the first time in years, they received their full water allocation. And go to the next slide, please. And this stabilized operations through 2024. But the winter has been dry so far, and they're concerned about if cuts are going to come again this year. They won't know until the spring. As the water they depend on becomes less certain, the farm has created a climate adaptation plan. And it's integrating a variety of strategies to survive in years where they don't receive access to their full water allocation. So next slide. Lead irrigator Michael Vicente has meticulously replaced thousands of center pivot nozzles to maximize the efficiency of every drop in water. Grants have become really critical for their survival. Last fall, the farm joined a pilot program to research alternative forage crops. And the Inflation Reduction Act opened unprecedented additional funding to support water-saving measures across the Western U.S. But some of these programs are being jeopardized by cuts that the current administration is seeking to implement. So, the farm's efforts really show a community that's undergoing extreme hardship and is taking risks to adapt. And their work is helping create a roadmap for farms that are dealing with unreliable water access and looking for sustainable pathways forward. I think their story really highlights how existing shortages and struggles that many communities in the northern parts of the river system have, when they're dependent on these smaller reservoirs. And they have already been facing shortages during the ongoing drought if you're a community with a smaller reservoir. In central Arizona, a farm community that was the first to lose its entire water supply from the river due to shortages now relies completely on wells that pump water from aquifers beneath their feet. And compounding the uncertainty of less water, in recent years, record-breaking heat waves gripped the southwestern US for weeks during summer. So punctuated by dust storms, temperatures well past thresholds deemed safe for human activity really became normal. So by mid-morning on these farms, you were seeing temperatures often clearing 100 degrees. And farmers in this area remember water tables failing before the community received Colorado River water. And some of the older farmers really question how much the aquifer can sustain before, former problems kind of resurface. And I think that these farmers' story really highlights the importance of groundwater management, right? So this is coming under pressure as river water diminishes. Where do you get water in the desert? And I think it also raises question about Western farmers' futures. North of the farm, row after row of gleaming solar panels are starting to replace fields as solar companies are buying out farmlands, which you can see in this slide here. And further south on the river, farmers in the Imperial Valley receive the largest share of Colorado River water of any community. And to reach the valley, water gets diverted through hundreds of miles through very complex canal systems that are cutting through some pretty surreal desert landscapes, like you see here. And Imperial is the largest irrigation district by water volume in the entire United States. So every year, this 500,000 acre valley receives about the same amount of water as Arizona and Nevada combined. And because their water is getting delivered from large reservoirs and also the legal structure of the priority system secures senior water rights, farmers here have only recently been being impacted by shortages, and each reduction has been voluntary and also compensated. And there's a small number of farming families here that hold some of the most senior water rights on the river, and that supports quite a bit of agricultural production. So a substantive portion of land is dedicated to alfalfa and forage crops, but there's also large produce operations. So if you're eating a salad in DC or New York this winter, it's pretty likely that Colorado River water grew your produce. I think as communities from Denver to San Diego are feeling the impacts of shortages, the Valley has really come under increasing pressure to cut their water use and help bear the burden of climate change. How people think about water and how it should be used, I think is often determined by personal values. So water managers under pressure are in the process of trying to adapt laws and infrastructure that was established 100 years ago to meet environmental conditions they really didn't imagine. And these are really difficult conversations. For those who rely on the river, water is both life and economic survival. Every drop given up means land going back to desert, habitat damaged, or economic opportunity lost. And so I think the thin blue arteries that kind of surround the Imperial Valley and demarcate desert land from farmland are a reminder of that fact for the people that live there. And farmers considering giving up their water are asking what other communities in the basin are willing to give up to contribute to long-term solutions in return for the loss of their farmland and water. I want to close just with a brief discussion of how shortages have impacted the river's ecology and its natural systems. I think that's really part of this story too. 100 years ago, the Colorado River ended in a vast 2 million acre expanse of blue waters and verdant trees that formed its delta. And it was deep enough for steamships to cross through, and it supported a thriving ecosystem and so many birds and other wildlife species. This photograph was taken in the former delta on a 120-degree day in 2021. And a bleached skeleton of a crab was one of the few signs that life had pretty much ever existed in this place. And the delta's disappearance was an early indication that human management of the river was really pushing the system past its natural capacity. We saw in the 1930s construction of major dams and diversions, redirecting water from the river to reservoirs, farms, and cities. So by 1960, the water had stopped regularly flowing to its delta. There are some interesting innovative partnerships and projects that show possibilities for alternative management to support, a portion of critical natural corridors. South of the US-Mexico border, there's a binational coalition called Raise the River, and that's rebuilding areas of critical natural habitat in the river's former delta. And in the last decade, they've restored over 1,500 acres across several sites using what they measure as less than 1% of the river's annual flow. And in these areas, Audubon researchers have found that species populations are 80% greater than in the surrounding depleted areas. So some promising signs there. And then mining and contaminants pose a separate risk to water quality. And I think they're another issue that are facing this freshwater system. So sites near the river, such as Pinyon Plain Mine, which sits within miles of the rim of the Grand Canyon, are deeply contested by some local stakeholders, such as the Havasupai, whose way of life and history is tied to the river and nearby areas of critical religious and cultural importance. Other communities have expressed concern about the risk of contaminants harming important aquifers, arguing that the mine is not worth risking harm to a national park or contaminating a river that millions rely on to drink water from, grow food, and swim in. I guess I would just end this by saying that the Colorado River system is a really complex basin, and it's under extreme stress in a region that has very few other freshwater resources. And managing it and reaching solutions to address existing issues on the river is going to require continued sustained leadership, informed federal, state, and local policymakers that are aware of its history, the hydrology, the science, its communities, and also extensive engagement between stakeholders. So thank you so much.
That was a tremendous presentation, Caitlin. I'm a terrible photographer, and so not only could I not have taken those photos, not even close, I certainly couldn't have taken them in such a way that tells such a great story. You really felt like there weren't any captions that I could see, but it was like they had captions. You knew exactly how one flowed into the other. So tremendous presentation. Thank you very much. Great reminder that all of our presentation materials today will be available or are actually already available if you go to the briefing page for this briefing at www.eesi.org. That goes for Caitlin. It also goes for our next two speakers as well. That brings us to Jack Schmidt. Jack is the Janet Quinney Lawson Chair in Colorado River Studies and Director of the Center for Colorado River Studies. He's worked for nearly 40 years on understanding river processes and seeking solutions to fundamental problems of river management. Between 2011 and 2014, Jack served as chair of the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center of the U.S. Geological Survey. Jack, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Okay, let's flip to the next slide. The story that I'm going to tell is essentially exactly what Caitlin just told, except I'm going to do it in a much more boring way with maps and graphs. And so I apologize. And I also apologize that I don't have control of a cursor, so I can't point to things. So here we go. On the left is a map of the Colorado River. And you can see a black line through the middle of the map, which is essentially the boundary between the upper Colorado River Basin and the lower Colorado River Basin. And you can see that where the Colorado River goes through that black line, that point is Lee's Ferry, which is approximately the demarcation point between the two basins. And we often speak about water flow at Lee's Ferry because that essentially represents the collection point of all the water coming out of the Rocky Mountains and flowing down to the deserts of the lower basin. I want to point out a couple things. In the red hatchered lines that are all primarily outside, or these significant areas beyond the limits of the watershed boundary, are major use areas of Colorado River water. You can see the Colorado Front Range cities in the upper right, the Albuquerque area, the Wasatch Front along the where Salt Lake City is, the vast complex of Southern California and the Southern California cities. These are all areas that use the water. And when Caitlin said vast numbers of people use the water, primarily that's where they live, somewhere else. Here's a little factoid. The largest city on the banks of the Colorado River, you know what it is? It's San Luis Rio Colorado in Mexico, and its population is less than 200,000 people. The largest U.S. city on the banks of the river is Yuma, population 100,000. The largest city on the banks of the river in the upper basin, Grand Junction, population less than 80,000 people. So a large fate of the Colorado River's water is its use outside of the basin. And when water is taken to Phoenix and Tucson, it also does not return to the Colorado River. The Colorado River is depicted as a plumbing system on the right in a famous drawing from a High Country News article of many, many decades ago. The size of the reservoirs of the Colorado River Basin is larger in relationship to the natural flow of the river than any other watershed in North America. And Lake Mead and Lake Powell are the two largest reservoirs in the United States. Let's go. Oh, and I should also say that that the Colorado has long been termed America's Nile because it's the same story. The water comes from a distant place. In the case of the Nile, equatorial Africa and Ethiopia, and flows downstream to the most ancient of civilizations that was entirely dependent on the Nile, that was Egypt. The Colorado River comes from distant mountain headwaters of snowmelt, and its earliest uses were at the far downstream end. Next slide. Now, in blue on this map, in light blue are the major source areas of water. The skeleton drawing of the river network, the width of those lines are proportional to the natural flow of the river in the middle of the 20th century. And in each of the red graphs is an average hydrology of the river from January to December, with the river being low and then a big pulse during the snowmelt season. And if you follow those pulses from the gauging stations in the upper basin, they swept all the way through and out and into the Gulf of California, also known as the Sea of Cortez. This is the natural river. And the construction of dams was to even out this flow so that there would be more flow during the low flow seasons when agriculture was needed, particularly in the lower basin. Next slide. Now, this is an average water budget for the watershed in the 21st century. And I'm going to use the units of million acre feet, which is the language of legal documents and the language that we describe the river. A little more than 12 million acre feet of natural runoff from the Rocky Mountains, about 4 million of which is used within the upper basin and arrives all in Lake Powell. Slightly more than 1 million acre feet evaporates off the surfaces of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, and about 800,000 acre feet of water enters the Colorado River within the Grand Canyon, primarily from springs. That is the water released from Hoover Dam and Davis Dam, where that water is essentially nearly entirely diverted to California, Arizona, and the Imperial Valley, and 1.5 million acre feet crosses the international border, all of which is diverted onto Mexican farm fields, and no water, zero water, makes it to the sea. Next slide. Now, here's in the upper left, and I'm going to come back to this, but in the upper left is a graph of the amount of water in storage in the large reservoirs, 46 reservoirs in the watershed, and that is the blue line. And the far left, you can see the very top when the reservoirs were last filled, just as we began the 21st century. And the far right is where we are today. These values are as of a few days ago, and here's another factoid. Slightly more than 60% of all the water stored in reservoirs in the basin are just in Mead and Powell, period. 30% of all the water is stored in all of the reservoirs of the upper basin, and slightly, and 8% are stored in Lake Mojave and Lake Havasu. So there are some values, and we'll come back to these. Next slide. So if we look at this in more detail, the things to see here is that you can see that the pattern of reservoir storage in Powell and Mead really is where all the action is, and that Lake Mojave and Lake Havasu change very little, essentially not at all. You can see that all of the reservoirs in total upstream from Powell go up and down with every year. There have been some small blips, and the sum of what's in the green line and the red line, if you add them together, that's responsible for the difference between the Powell-Mead line and the blue line. The blue line is everything, and you can see that the fate of water in Powell and Mead is essentially the total storage in the system. What's also important is that you can see that it hasn't been a gradual decline. You can see that the reservoir storage plunged between 2000 and 2005, and then changed relatively little, decreased a bit until 2020, and then plunged again from 2020 to 2022. There were two big episodes of loss of storage. Next slide. So now let's take a close-up of the last few years. So I've just blown up the area that was in that red circle. And this is simply the history of how much water is in the reservoirs with a slightly different scale, but the same data. And you can see in the blue line at the top, the total storage in the system. And in March of 2023, let's remember, the amount of water in the system was as low as it had ever been since the reservoirs were filling and created. That was the abject crisis of the early 2020s. And in the next, and you can see at the bottom, the red line of Mojave and Havasu, that doesn't change. And then you can see the amount of water in Meade, the amount of water in Powell, and the amount of water in all the other reservoirs upstream from Powell. You can see that Powell and the reservoirs upstream sort of go together in their fluctuations. And you can see that Lake Meade is sort of a counter narrative. It fills when Powell goes down. And in fact, even right now, water is being released out of Powell and storage is accumulated in Lake Meade. And when you look at these numbers, essentially 30% of the total water storage in the basin is in Lake Meade. A little less than 30% is in Lake Powell. The upper basin, a little less than 30% is in the everything upstream, 8% below. So 30, 30, 30, 10. That's another message to remember, a little factoid of the basin and why Meade and Powell are so important. Next slide. Why do we have a crisis? Every dot on this graph is the estimated natural flow if there were no humans living in the basin as estimated by reclamation. The black squiggly line is sort of the running average, and the 3 bars are the averages for those periods of time. And what we call the millennium drought since 2020, the natural supply of the river has been 13% less than the average from the period of most of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, it was unusually wet, and that's when the Colorado River Compact was negotiated. But the point is, we have less water as a result of a warming climate and all of its manifestations. Next slide. But the proximate cause of the water crisis is that we simply aren't able in our political agreements to immediately reduce consumption as quickly as the highly variable climate demands. In blue is the year-to-year supply, those data from the Bureau of Reclamation, and I've added in the supply from the Grand Canyon as well. And in red are Reclamation's total estimates of all the water use in the US and in Mexico, plus reservoir evaporation. And when the red line is higher than the blue line, you're deficit spending. And look at all that deficit spending between 2000 and 2005. That's when reservoir storage crashed. And then look at the year 2020 to 2022, another 3-year period when we weren't able to decrease use as quickly. And the problem with the 2020 to 2022 period was that we drained the bank account. We could get away with deficit spending in the earliest part of the 21st century because we had a big bank account. But then we never replenished it. And then when we had the next overdraft period, we were in major crisis. Next slide. The law of the river is complex. It includes interstate compacts, a treaty with Mexico, Supreme Court rulings, and I'm not going to try to explain it, but I would just point out on the right, the populations of the basin when the compact was negotiated are completely different from the populations today. The population of all of the basin states in 1920, including California, was barely more than the population of New York City. Next slide. And so what needs to be negotiated in these post-2026 negotiations? We need to balance consumption and supply. Everybody agrees with that. But the problem is, who is going to take the pain of cutting? And we must recover reservoir storage. And then we have to ask also the question, as we make those negotiations, how do we care about river ecosystems and whether tribes matter. Next slide. I'm just going to say here, because I'm nearly out of time, that we had a big, if we just look at the blue line, 2023 was a year in which we recovered storage from abject crisis. But in 2024, that little blip was in a very good snow year. And yet we didn't gain much, and we've already spent more than we gained in what was a good year. And in the coming year, this year is not as good as last year. We are not recovering storage. Next slide. And let me just close with this, and then we'll skip to my conclusion slide. When I think about the environmental issues of the Grand Canyon, I agree with Caitlin. The most critical issue is the delta, because the delta in Mexico is downstream of every use. And to restore any semblance of an environment there takes an enlightened decision to not use water upstream. And that is, in fact, the most controversial thing you could possibly do. There are big issues in the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon issues are less controversial. Why? Because water has to go through the Grand Canyon on its way to the big users in California, Arizona, and Mexico. So it's got issues, but it's a little bit more casual because you do have water to work with. The upper basin, it's even less of, you've got lots of free-flowing rivers, but you do have some heavily diverted and depleted rivers like the Dolores and the Duchesne. And now let's go ahead to the last conclusion slide. Well, yeah, keep going. I'm just going to skip through the, keep going. There we go. All right, so 30, 30, 30, 10, that's the issue of where the water is stored. We have to remember the crisis has both an ultimate and approximate cause. We really care mostly in an environment about the Delta. The Grand Canyon and the Upper Basin are slightly easier issues to deal with. And the real crux of the negotiation is who is going to absorb the pain of shortage and drought. And we are doing a poor job of rebuilding reservoir storage. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. That was a great presentation. Good maps. Everyone should go to the website and check those out because lots of great information and charts, maps and charts. A great compliment to Caitlin's presentation. We have time at the end of our panel section today for questions. If you're in our online audience and you would like to ask our panelists a question, the best way to do that is to send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, @eesi.org, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can during that portion of the program today. That brings up Brian Richter. Brian is the president of Sustainable Waters, a global organization focused on water scarcity challenges, where he promotes sustainable water use and management with governments, corporations, universities, and local communities. He previously served as director of the Global Water Program of the Nature Conservancy, an international conservation organization. Brian has consulted on more than 170 water projects worldwide, and he's with us today. Brian, thank you for being part of our panel today. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Dan, and it's a real pleasure to join this, and thank you so much for featuring the Colorado River in this series. It's has some really big issues, as you're hearing, and I'm going to summarize some things. And also, I'm going to pose a handful of solutions for us to all think about going forward. So this first slide is, I want to remind everybody of a very important thing that Jack said just a moment ago. Jack said that there is no water left in the Colorado River by the time it reaches the Gulf of California. So that means we use up all of the water that comes down the Colorado River year after year. And so when somebody says, where does that water go? That's a really big question. And it's one that we tackled last year with a large group of scientists, Jack included. And the pie chart here kind of breaks that down. And you can see that, that the lion's share of the river, more than half, slightly more than half of the entire river goes to irrigated farms, irrigated agriculture. About a third that much, about 18%, goes to urban areas, what we call municipal and commercial and industrial uses. The next biggest category is nature itself. The yellow slice of the pie there is the water that is taken up by the natural vegetation, those beautiful cottonwood forests and wetland areas that line both the main channel of the Colorado River as well as all of its tributaries, and sustaining that wonderful and important vegetation for wildlife and habitat and scenic beauty and for recreation and all those purposes. That does take up some of the Colorado River water. The last category there is the water that is stored in those reservoirs that Jack talked about, and they're constantly evaporating water. And so it's not an inconsequential amount. We estimated about 11% is going up into the atmosphere off of the surface of those reservoirs. So let's click and go to the next slide, please, or next image there. So that first pie that I showed you was where the whole river goes. Now, if you only look at the percentages of the water that's used directly, intentionally for human purposes, we can break it simplistically into these two categories. Almost 3/4 of that water that we directly use is going to irrigated agriculture, and a little bit less than 1/4 is going for urban purposes, municipal and industrial and commercial uses. Okay, click again. And then if we subdivide that big orange slice in the middle image there, the middle pie there, and we look at the agricultural use in a little bit more detail, this is how it breaks out. And I'm only highlighting the major crops here. You can see that, you know, almost 1/4 of that pie is going to other crops that account for a lesser percentage. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is, if you look at the two green, darker green and light green slices there, half of the water used in irrigated agriculture is going to produce one crop, alfalfa. And the second greenish slice there is going to other grass hay. And so between the two of those, 62%, almost 2/3 of the water used in agriculture is going to those two types of crops. And we collectively refer to those crops as cattle feed crops. So those cattle feed crops are used to grow cattle, obviously. And it's something on the order of about 2/3 is going to produce beef, and about 1/3 is going to produce dairy products. So milk, yogurt, cheese, and other dairy products. So if you take those green slices out of that right side pie, it ends up being one of the very largest uses in the entire river basin. Okay, click again. Next slide. Okay, so again, just to sort of follow on to some of those slices of the pie previously. So cities and industries, as I mentioned, account for about 26% of the water consumed directly for human purposes. But a really important thing to understand about the dynamics of water use in the Colorado River Basin is cities that use Colorado River water have been doing a pretty miraculous job of reducing how much water they use. And this is a direct response to the water scarcity that both Caitlin and Jack were talking about. So when things started to become troubling, when it started to look like the reservoirs were going down and that we might be headed in the wrong direction, a lot of the urban areas got really serious about water conservation. So you see the statistic there that oftentimes people say that the reason that we have a water crisis in the Colorado River Basin is because these cities have been growing like a weed. And in fact, They are. You know, we estimated that their populations have grown by about 24% since the year 2000. And yet here's the miraculous part. Those cities have collectively been able to use 18% less water. We refer to this as decoupling. So historically, for populations all around the world, as a population grew, its water use grew, you know, in lockstep. Well, what we're seeing in the Colorado River Basin now is a separation of those trends, a decoupling of those trends. And it's been a really, really important part of the understanding of water use within the Colorado River Basin. So those cities weren't just able to keep their water use stable, but they actually decreased it by 18% on average. Please click again. I've got another graph that'll pop up here. So here's one illustration, just for Denver, one of the cities that was on Jack's map. It's outside the actual physical watershed boundaries of the Colorado River, but a lot of water gets piped through the Rocky Mountains to the east over to what we call the Front Range cities. So everything from Colorado Springs to Denver, to Aurora, to Boulder, to Fort Collins, those cities rely pretty heavily on Colorado River water. And so when we take a look at how Denver has been able to do since 2000, again, pretty phenomenal story here. Population grew by 29%, and yet they were able to use 16% less water over that time period. And I could show you more graphs from all the other cities dependent upon the Colorado River, but the story remains very much the same. Okay, click. So it's important to understand how these urban areas have been able to accomplish this success story. So how did they do it? Let's click and let's look at a couple of different ways here. Very importantly, and this, I would say that for urban water use, this has been the biggest part of the success story, is that many of these cities have been able to reduce their outdoor use of water, their use of water to grow their outdoor landscaping. It'll surprise a lot of people to know that the city of Las Vegas has been the rock star here. We think of Las Vegas as being this profligate user of water, fountains shooting it up in the air, lots of golf courses, and it just seems like there's, you know, water use taking place everywhere. But it turns out that Las Vegas is really a water conservation rock star. And one of the things they've done is they've been able to get their residents and their businesses to substantially reduce their outdoor watering. And they've done this largely by paying them to do so. In other words, Las Vegas presently, the last time I looked, Las Vegas is paying homeowners about $3 per square foot of green grass lawn to rip it out and replace it with more of a drought tolerant vegetation, drier grasses, shrubs, things that are more acclimated to the natural climate there. And this is a really, really important part of this story because across the Western United States, it's very typical for cities to be using 40%, 50%, even 60% of the water use in their cities is being used outdoors. So one of the first places to look is, can we somehow reduce all that use of water outside? Everything from green grass lawns to golf courses to commercial landscaped areas. Okay, click again. Another really, really important part of the water conservation story in cities is by replacing or just installing for the first time highly water efficient plumbing fixtures. What are we talking about? Toilets, washing machines, dishwashers, and that sort of thing. At the US level, those plumbing fixtures, the move toward more efficient, think about low flush toilets, the move toward those more efficient plumbing fixtures has been credited with reducing water use across the United States by almost 20%. And cities have really grabbed on to this potential. It's one of the most commonly used levers in urban water conservation. And again, a lot of cities are doing it using financial incentives. They're paying homeowners to rip out their old water guzzling toilets and replace them with high efficiency, very low flush toilets, and not just toilets, but dishwashers, washing machines, et cetera. And this is a really, really important thing. And I think there's a lot of discussion right now about the value of these efficient water fixtures. And I think we need to all bear in mind that this is the most powerful tool that cities have been using to reduce their water use and get out of water trouble. Okay, next click. Another way that cities have done it is by adjusting the price that they ask their residents to pay per unit of water. And what we mean by tiered rate is that basically, as you use more water, you're going to pay more for each unit of higher use. So these tiered rate structures start out very low per gallon or per 1,000 gallons, however that you want to think about it. And that's really important because a lot of people in the United States, a lot of people in the Western US are having trouble affording their monthly water bills. And so it's really important to keep the first tranche of water use in a household as low as we possibly can. But then as you go to higher and higher levels of water use, that you start to increase the price per gallon as you get up in those higher tiers. So it's been a very, very effective way to control water use, very much like the way that different gasoline prices affect how much people drive or their decision to shift to higher efficiency vehicles. Price matters a lot to all of us. And so this has been a very, very effective strategy. Okay, click. And the last one I'm going to highlight for urban water conservation is leak detection and repair. So there's an awful lot of water that just escapes out of leaking pipes in its route from the river to the water treatment plants, and then from the water treatment plants out into your homes and businesses. Unfortunately, we lose a lot of water to leaky pipes. It's really quite shocking, but a lot of cities are experiencing leakage rates of 30 or 40% that just never makes it from the water treatment plant out to the homes and businesses. So, and part of the reason is it's really, really hard to figure out where these leaks are occurring. So the technology has gotten a lot more sophisticated on that. They run cameras down pipe systems and discover where these leaks are. And then it's expensive to dig up the pipe and patch it or replace sections of pipe. So a lot of cities have a big job ahead of them, but there's a lot of potential for more water savings. And I would say across all of these categories, there's still a great deal of potential for cities to go even further with their water conservation. Again, I want to give them credit for miraculous performance so far, but there's still a lot more room to run on water conservation. Okay, next slide, please. The other category often is referred to as the big gorilla in water use in the Colorado River Basin is irrigated farms, and that's because the farms use 3 times more than all the cities and industries combined. They use about 3/4 of all the water that gets consumed directly from the Colorado River. And so it's important to understand that because a relatively small percentage of reduction of conservation in farm water use can add up to an awful lot of water, a boatload of water. And so if we can find ways to tweak the way that farm water use how farm water is being used, we can go a long ways toward resolving some of these issues in the Colorado River. And I would go so far to say that we're not going to rebalance, as Jack was pointing out, and Caitlin also made this point, we're not going to be able to rebalance the water budget of the Colorado River system, bringing our consumption of water in line with the natural replenishment of water. We're not going to be able to accomplish that without addressing water conservation and irrigated agriculture in a very, very big way. You could literally wipe all the cities and industries off the map in the Colorado River Basin, or all the cities and industries that use Colorado River water, and you would barely be accomplishing that rebalancing. And so that's an important point to make, that we have to do a really, really big job on farm water conservation. Okay, click. Okay, so again, how are we going to do that? All right, click. We'll go to the first bullet. So one strategy is to simply replace some of the more water intensive crops with crops that don't require as much water. This is actually becoming a necessity in a lot of places, because not just with the reduction in water availability, but also with the warming temperatures, a lot of farmers aren't going to be able to continue to grow the same crops a decade from now or a couple of decades from now, because certain crops are just going to get too stressed from the heat, and we can't control that stress by putting more and more water on it. And so it's going to be increasingly important to think about other crops that we could switch to. And one of my research groups did an analysis of this and some of the potential here. And it is an important strategy to be thinking about for reducing irrigation needs. Click for the next bullet. We can also lower the production, the volume of crops on each of our farms. So what does that mean? So it means that, you've got the same farm with the same crop being produced on it, whether it's alfalfa or corn or hay or cotton, but maybe you're not producing as much of it on that farm. The easiest way to illustrate this, and one that's getting a lot of discussion in the Colorado River Basin, is with alfalfa and grass hays, those cattle feed crops that I highlighted previously. Those are crops that get harvested multiple times over the course of the irrigation season. So if you're way up in the headwater states like Utah and Colorado and Wyoming, maybe you're getting 2 or 3 cuttings, 2 or 3 harvests of those cattle feed crops in an irrigation season, in a growing season. If you're down in the bottom end of the basin, near Yuma, you might be getting 8 to 10 cuttings of those kinds of crops. Now, if we could encourage and incentivize farmers to get half as many cuttings, produce half as much of those crops, or whatever the fraction is, we can save an awful lot of water. And so Caitlin used the terms voluntary, compensated, and those are terms that are being used a lot now to talk about how do you incentivize a farmer to grow less of the crop that he or she has been growing? Well, if you're going to ask them to do that, we have to find some way to compensate them for the lost farm revenue that they would have gotten by growing that crop. Okay, click to the next bullet. We can also irrigate more efficiently. What does that mean? Well, that means that maybe you change the way that you apply water to the farm. Maybe it means instead of running water down a dirt earthen canal or irrigation ditch, you line it with concrete. There are a variety of different ways to reduce the loss of water and to use less water on the same farm field. Now, I'm quick to offer a caution here. This by far and away is the most common approach that's been taken around the world in places where they're trying to reduce the amount of water needed in farming. In the vast majority of those places around the world that have tried this have failed to save any water. And here's the reason, is because the farmers that are becoming more efficient in their irrigation use turn around and use whatever water is saved to grow more crop. And so they end up using just as much and sometimes more water than they did previously, because they got to be a lot more careful, a lot more efficient at the way that they apply that water. So they can actually ironically increase their water use rather than decrease it. By the way, this has been referred to by the term the irrigation efficiency paradox. It's a paradox because you thought you were going to be saving water, and in fact, you didn't. So really the only way to do this, to save water with this approach, is by simply not delivering the water to the farms in the first place. It never goes into the canal and into the irrigation ditch. You just leave it in the river, leave it in the groundwater aquifer, and it never gets, never gets out onto the farms. So you lessen the amount that gets delivered according to the improvement in the efficiency out on the farms. Okay, let's click it again. This one, temporary fallowing of some farmland. What does fallowing mean? So some of you, that may not be familiar to you. It means basically resting, temporarily retiring a portion of your farmland for a year, maybe a couple of years, maybe even 3 years at a time. And of course, when you're doing that, you're not having to use irrigation water. This is the primary lever that's being used on farms in the Colorado River Basin presently. There is a tremendous amount of money that's being used to compensate the farmers that have been volunteering to do this. In the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed under the Biden administration, there was $4 billion of the IRA that was dedicated to conserving water in the Colorado River Basin, and the vast majority of that money is going to compensating farmers to temporarily fallow some portion of their farmland. And this is a very effective strategy, but I want to also emphasize the word temporary. If you're going to continue to save that water using this strategy, you're going to have to continue to pay the farmers year after year after year. And again, we're spending billions of dollars to do it presently. Maybe something on the order of $1 billion or more per year. And are we really going to be willing to continue to allocate that much compensation to this particular strategy is a big question going forward. I got one more here. Let's click one more time. Okay, so I think we have to have a tough conversation about some permanent retiring and repurposing of some portion of farmland. In the Central Valley of California, where they're facing similar dire water crises, water shortage issues, water scarcity, the conversation out in the Central Valley is the possibility of retiring as much as 20% of all of the irrigated farmland out there. I don't know what the number might be for the Colorado River system. It's very, very controversial for obvious reasons. But there's no way of escaping the fact that the total agricultural footprint, all of the harvested acres presently, cannot be sustained under the present level of water availability, much less under the water availability 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So we have to have this very difficult conversation. And the sooner that we can have a conversation about all of these strategies, the better the swifter we'll be moving toward that rebalancing act that Jack and Caitlin referred to. I think I might have one more slide. Guess not. Thanks very much.
I see you, Brian, trying to steal my slide. We can't have that. Thank you very much for that. We have a little bit of time left in our briefing today for questions and answers. So some are coming in. If you would like to send us a question for Caitlin, Jack, and Brian, you can send us an email. And the email address to use is ask, that's ask@eesi.org. You can also follow us on social media at EESI Online. While we wait for additional questions to come in, I'm going to get us started. And Caitlin, it's been a little while since we've heard from you and seen your nice photos. Maybe we'll start the discussion to bring the conversation back to, sort of a federal policy audience, which is, EESI's core audience. So do you have any thoughts about what federal policy levers might be used to strengthen the resilience of the Colorado River and the surrounding communities? I know Brian just talked a lot about solutions, but specifically reorienting things to kind of a federal policy lever landscape. Do you have any thoughts about that? And then we can hear from Jack and Brian.
Sure, definitely. And I think, Brian did mention some really good practical applications of some of this federal funding that, we have seen come in through the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. I think the USDA received 3.1 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, and they made that available in the 2024 fiscal year for climate smart ag activities. And, this is through programs like the EQUIP Environmental Quality Incentives Program and the Rural Energy for America program. So there are farmers that signed contracts with the USDA under those programs, and they paid up front to, build some of these things, plant new crops, install these systems with the guarantee or the expectation that the federal government would issue the grants and cover part of their costs. And so some of this money has been frozen. And so these farmers are now on the hook, so I think there's the question of like continuing to supply and fund these programs that are supporting the farmers that are trying to make these very difficult transitions. And, just a thought I had as you were speaking, Brian, like after spending so much time on farms is like, I think it's also important to remember how long these changes take. Like farms implement one change across a growing season. So you're talking about like trying to do a lot of changes and you're talking about working with the time of growing seasons. So I think that's really important to consider and think about because, alternative forage crop is under researched, and there's all these under researched areas that, federal funding could hypothetically support. And that research helps farmers be able to better plant if they are interested in doing that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of space for that, but I will let Brian and Jack field this one as well.
Jack, maybe we'll go to you next. Thoughts about federal policy levers that might be brought to bear on some of these challenges?
There's so much. Let me just first point would be we should remember that the Colorado River is in a sense, is a deeply federally managed system. The federal government is the manager of the river. Now, if you ask the states, they would say the federal government manages our water. The federal government manages the state's water. But whatever the case, it's a governmental management system. And so we should never forget that. I would just cascade through the major roles that the federal government plays. The federal government is the funder of climate science. The federal government is the funder of hydrologic measurements, whether it's snowpack or it's stream flow. Those are the data that are, without it, you can't scientifically manage the resource. The federal government is the funder of dealing with the ultimate cause of the declining supply, a warming climate. And if we ever forget that all projections point to an ever declining supply, the crisis that we have now is only going to get worse. And so we must continue to deal with the ultimate problem of carbon loading in the atmosphere. We must deal with understanding climate projections and the changing and declining snowpack and supply. And then I would just say that within the context of the negotiations, the approach has been to let the states try to decide the allocation agreements within themselves, and the federal government sort of coax along the process. The federal government might need to play a much stronger role to use casual language, to be the grown-up in the room and force a negotiated settlement. Strong federal leadership may be needed. Only the federal government can negotiate with Mexico about what proportion of cuts Mexico will take. And of course, it is the federal government that manages the great national parks of the river and all of the resources and the endangered species along the river. And so the federal government is an essential part of essentially every part of managing the river.
Brian, you've heard what Caitlin and Jack were saying about federal policy. Do you have any additional thoughts about federal policy levers that could be brought to bear on some of these water challenges?
Yeah, sure, Dan. And of course, all thumbs up on the point about funding, whether it's federal or state level. The incentivization of the changes that need to be made is absolutely necessary. I might bring a little bit of a different perspective to this question or to this conversation. One, because I'm not deeply embedded in the Colorado River discussions on a day-to-day level like a lot of people are. And over the course of my water career, I worked in more than 40 different countries around the world. And so I've thought a lot about the things that have worked in a lot of other places. And so let me share, two thoughts about that. One is that I don't think that we're doing an adequate job of fostering a conversation at the basin-wide level. We have an upper basin commission. We have a lower basin commission. They talk to each other, pretty frequently. They all get together in Las Vegas, once a year. But there's not really a unified body, a river basin commission, if you will, that can help to facilitate and foster that kind of a discussion. And in particular, Dan, I think that I would like to see the discussion move from what's presently a very reactive discussion of, oh, well, how are we going to operate the reservoirs, given what the water supply is this year or last year, and start to move to what we might call future building. Nelson Mandela did a magnificent job in South Africa when he came into power by changing the conversation from the immediate struggles at hand and getting the South Africans to start talking about future building. What do we want 10 years from now to look like? What do we want 20 years from now to look like? And I think that a river basin commission could help to facilitate that kind of conversation. The other point that I'm going to bring up, I wrote a book 10 years ago called Chasing Water. And the number one, what I consider to be the number one most important thing that I brought out in that book is the idea of setting a limit, or what we call a cap. We know that the Colorado River isn't going to produce what the framers of the Colorado River Compact thought we were going to have over 100 years ago. It's time to acknowledge and formalize what the sustainable, reliable volume of water is in that river system, and to affirm it, in a very formal way. And Jack knows a lot more about what that level might be, but I think it's important to affirm that. And of course, then you have the difficult problem of then assigning under that cap of the total use of the river basin, allocating it out to the 7 basin states in Mexico. But the beauty of a cap is that it sort of affirms that, look, this is the new reality. This is what we're going to have to live with. We may have to adjust the cap as the climate changes over time. Maybe every 5 years we ratchet it, appropriately. But it sends a very clear message that we have to live within nature's water limits now. And that sends a very important message out that it's time to get really, really serious about water conservation. And it happens to also stimulate the kind of planning that I was referring to a moment ago.
Thanks, Brian. I was also wondering if you would mention water efficiency standards, EPA's Water Sense program, some of those additional conservation programs that the local governments you talked about. You talked about Las Vegas being a water conservation all-star. A lot of the local action is made possible by the really, really modest investments at the federal level in EPA and DOE programs that encourage that. So I just want to we never miss an opportunity to plug Energy Star and Water Sense here at EESI. So I just wanted to do that, and standards too. Thanks for that. We got an interesting question. I don't know who maybe is the right person to answer this, so you can nervously look at each other to figure out who was first, and maybe we'll just have to, wing it. But it's an interesting question, and that has to do with rebuilding the health of soils. So we talked a lot about how much of the water, is used for agricultural purposes, that, is growing stuff out of the ground. How about rebuilding the health of soils to allow them to hold more of the water applied in the root zone? And would that allow production to continue with lower levels of irrigation? Is soil health something that parts of the Colorado River Basin are experimenting with? Is that something that anyone here has any experience with, that they could talk about the potential as a conservation strategy or a strategy to reduce irrigation demand?
I could start if you like. We a few years ago, I pulled together a group of university students, and we looked at field studies, experimental studies and field studies of efforts to conserve water in irrigated agriculture, from all around the world. And the issue that was raised by that question of improving soil health, whether it's, whether you label that as being through regenerative agriculture or, different farming practices that really help to foster healthy soils. The indications are that, in fact, that ability to hold more moisture in the soil can reduce the irrigation demands. But I will say to the advocates of soil health and regenerative agriculture, we desperately need more definitive science on this. We need credible science on this. I have no doubt that it works, but until we have really, really detailed studies that can document in different soil types and under different crop conditions how much water gets saved, it's going to take that kind of proof, that kind of formal, scientifically credible proof to be able to get that strategy up to scale, I think.
Caitlin, Jack, do you have any thoughts on the issue of regenerative agriculture or soil health?
Yeah, I think that is a discussion, and you've had American Rivers and several of the other kind of conservation groups really discuss agricultural reform or regen ag as a big possibility. But I think Brian's right, and I think again it's a time game, and we're talking about reservoirs that are fairly depleted. A deadline to come up with these sort of guidelines in the coming year and few months. And so I think long-term, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of very interesting research in that space. And it's connected to watershed health. You have a lot of reservoir managers now talking to nearby forest managers, because all these systems are interconnected, right? So it's how do we build system resiliency overall, and yes, every piece counts. But I think, it's the biggest thing is how do you shift from kind of disaster response, or when people say stabilize the system, it sounds very vague, but it literally means if water gets to a certain point, the infrastructure of the dams is not capable of reliably delivering water to people. So, that's what system stability, which sounds very jargony, that's what it practically means for all these people who need the river.
Great, thanks for that. We've mentioned a couple programs. We were just talking about regenerative agriculture. EESI has done briefings on that topic. We also, I think someone mentioned EQIP and REAP, Rural Energy for America program, and EQIP. We also have Farm Bill resources on those topics. So if folks in our online audience today want to learn more about those programs and also keep track of how those programs are or may evolve in the context of an upcoming Farm Bill negotiation, we have lots of great resources on all of those topics if you visit us online. And if you go to the resources tab and it's called Farm Bill, you click there, you'll be all set. Well, let's maybe we can do, Jack, maybe it would make sense to start with you on this one, or maybe we could start with Brian on this one. We don't always want the same people to go first and last, but we've talked a lot about solutions. Brian did a great overview of solutions, and I'd love to come back to that idea because we talk a lot about that at EESI. Are there water conservation solutions or other solutions that have been used to make progress in improving how we manage the Colorado River and the water that runs through it? Are there other things out there that maybe aren't getting the level of attention that they need? Or are there, and I'll also give you opportunity to answer kind of the opposite way. Are there solutions that maybe aren't as much solutions? Maybe there's misconceptions about how effective the solutions are, that maybe people are being distracted by or that are taking up too much attention. Jack, start with you. If you,
Brian, you go.
Brian, you want to go first on this one, and then
Brian, you're much more familiar with this.
Well, okay.
All right, we'll do that.
Well, Dan, the one thing I'll say is that, we've got a really, really diverse and effective toolkit for conservation, for reducing, water use, whether it's in cities or in farms. That's what I tried to illustrate with my presentation. The big issue is that we're not applying those tools at the necessary scale to deal with the crisis in the Colorado River system. Jack, now I'm going to hand it back to you. So, I don't know the level. Both the cities and farms have been reducing their use over the last couple of decades. And that's been very important. But Jack has done a lot of assessment of what the scale is. In other words, how big does water conservation need to get, given the level of sort of overuse that we're presently experiencing. Jack, do you want to say something about that?
Well, we can certainly say that we have not yet succeeded. We do not have policies in place yet to rebuild reservoir storage. We are living on the edge of the brink of disaster. Yeah. And we cannot, what occurred in 2023 bailed us out at the absolute last moment. And that was a very unusual year that's only occurred very few times in the 21st century. And so we are not succeeding in doing what we need to do. And we are, well, I'll just stop there. Brian, why don't you go back? Okay, let's just tag team amongst us.
Yeah.
You have another thought, and then I've got one other thing I want to talk about.
Well, Jack, some of the big expenditures of money for water conservation that I mentioned earlier, more than $1 billion a year, going to farm, primarily temporary fallowing, and those allocations are very newsworthy. They make headlines that, we're doling out that much money to help incentivize the farmers to save water. But it's my sense that the level of investment in conservation is about a third to a fourth of where it needs to be. I mean, there's been a conversation, Jack, and you've used numbers like this. We may need to reduce consumption by 3 to 4 million acre feet a year.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. So if we're only getting a million acre feet per year out of these investments in farm water conservation, we're not getting anywhere close to the rebalancing act that we're talking about.
No.
And I think also to just build on that, again, it's like, what are we investing in with this sort of money and the long-term solutions? And I think that the voluntary payments have been very short-term, sort of. And there is some interesting research that has happened in the space of temporary fallowing. I'm thinking specifically in the Imperial Valley. Dr. Ali Montazar has done some work with the Palo Verde district, which is slightly north of the valley, and starting to work with Imperial, looking at, they call it deficit irrigation, right? So, how during summer months, the yield is not as valuable. It's not as good. You're using a lot more water to grow these stands of alfalfa because it's very hot. So their question was, if you cut water in these months, what does it do to the soil? Now, he did find a point that if you cut it too much for too long, you actually require more water to bring it back. So I think there's roles for every facet. I think one thing that comes to mind that I hear people talk about is importing water or or desalination as being these sort of solutions. And I think well, I don't know, no one has produced exactly where water will be imported from, but for the desal conversation, I think what I often don't hear discussed is how energy intensive it is. And we do have an energy problem that is interconnected with this water problem. So I think sometimes the thinking seems to be a tech solution or this sort of notion that in the future, we will get there. And I think the interesting question is, if we don't get there and we don't have a plan, then what is the basin going to do? And so I think I would add that portion to it.
And I would just stick in a couple things. First off, in terms of strategies that get talked about for which the science is very problematic, you often hear people talk about manipulating forests or eliminating forest cover to increase runoff. And that's quite a popular thing to get talked about, for which, frankly, the scientific data poorly supports that as a strategy for doing anything significant to increase supply. So I would suggest that is problematic. But in the long term, none of us has a time machine. None of us knows precisely what the future world will be. But there is great consensus that it will be warmer, and that in a river system like the Colorado, we will have ever declining supplies. And the projections are phenomenal, very large future cuts. We are never going to fill the reservoirs again. I would suggest that the things that aren't talked about, that will inevitably talked about, and this is heresy to say, is that right now the discussion and the debate is between the upper basin and the lower basin. The upper basin says, we were supposed to get half the deal. You guys in the lower basin use twice as much as us. You guys make all the cuts. It's all a legal interpretation of past agreements. But as Brian showed us, the problem and the issue is really that more than half the water is used for livestock feed. Long ago, Mark Reisner, the author of Cadillac Desert, a book that probably 3/4 of the people on this Zoom call have all read. Mark Reisner said the American West doesn't have a water supply crisis. It has a water allocation crisis. And that's what Brian very quietly and nicely told us. And someday in the future, we're going to have to talk about the heresy. Where does water produce the most economic good for the nation? Where is water use the most important and best used to help the entire nation? And we will not be able to keep living in this, our benefit and our we are a nation of laws, and that is our greatest strength. And it's also what limits our ability to be adaptable and innovative. Because at some point, we're going to have to deal with these fundamental issues of water use on what kind of crops for what kind of economic return. And that's what we will be debating 50 years from now. We're not debating it now, but we will at a basin scale.
Great. Well, thank you, Jack. I'm afraid that we have to end there because we're out of time. But Caitlin and Jack and Brian, thank you for making great presentations today. If anyone would like to go back and revisit the presentations, the slides are available online. You can also rewatch the webcast that'll be posted shortly. And over the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll also get some summary notes up there too. So if you want to just sort of quickly find, one thing that people were talking about, that should help you do that. But thank you so much. Those great presentations. Really learned quite a bit. I actually do have a time machine, Jack. I'm sorry. I won't tell you where it is or how it works, but I do. I would also like to thank all of my colleagues at EESI for helping our briefing series take shape and to bring it to our audience today. Thanks to Dan O, to Anna, Molly, Nicole, Omri, Allison, and Hannah. Thank you all for all of your great help. We also have 3 tremendous interns this spring semester. So thanks to Hadley and Raneem and Whitney for all of their help behind the scenes. Also lurking behind the scenes is Troy, our videographer. Thank you again, Troy, for all the help that you do, or all the help that you give us to make this look so good and sound so good. Really appreciate it. We will be back on Capitol Hill next week with a briefing. Climate Camp will continue. There's 2 more installments. So I encourage everyone to visit us online and RSVP for the entire Climate Camp briefing series. There are also other briefings that are up there too. So check that out. We've got briefings coming out. We actually have our briefings pretty well scheduled through, I would say, August at this point. So those will be posted as we get closer, as we move through the year. We've got some really interesting topics coming out. The best way to keep up with our briefings, but also our fact sheets, our issue briefs, our podcasts, our articles, all of the other great stuff that we do, including our legislative tracking, our media mentions, all that great stuff. Subscribe to our bi-weekly newsletter. Climate Change Solutions comes out every other Tuesday, and you can do all of that by visiting us online at www.eesi.org. Lastly, I'm going to put that slide back up with the survey link. If you have any comments about how you thought the briefing went today, or if you had any problems with the webpage, or if you have ideas for future topics, if you just want to say, hey, why didn't you ask my question during the Q&A? All of that feedback is much appreciated. We always do our best to get to the questions, but we were at the mark today. But if anyone who'd like to submit the survey, we read every response. It means a lot that the people in our audience take time to share with us how we did. So we will go ahead and wrap it there. It looks like it stopped snowing in DC. I was actually going to volunteer our flurries today to maybe help with the snowpack out west. I don't think it would have mattered a whole lot. I don't see any of it sticking around, but it would have been a little something that we could have done. But I hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday, the short week. I think today's Wednesday. Hope everyone has a great rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you next week for the continuation of Congressional Climate Camp. Thanks, everybody.